Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Sarah, and joining me today is Michael.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic.
Today we'll be discussing a landmark case in Indian constitutional law, A.K.Gopalan v. State of Madras. This 1950 Supreme Court of India judgment dealt with some fundamental questions about personal liberty and preventive detention under the newly adopted Indian Constitution.
That's right, Sarah. This case came just months after India's constitution came into effect in January 1950, so it was one of the first major tests of how the Supreme Court would interpret the fundamental rights provisions.
Exactly. And it centered around the Preventive Detention Act of 1950, which allowed the government to detain individuals without trial if they were deemed a threat to public safety or national security. The petitioner, A.K.Gopalan, challenged the constitutional validity of this law.
Before we dive into the specifics of the case, it might be helpful to give our listeners some context about preventive detention laws and why they're controversial.
Good idea. Preventive detention essentially allows the government to imprison someone not for a crime they've committed, but for crimes they might potentially commit in the future. It's meant to prevent threats to public order or national security.
Which on the surface sounds reasonable. We want the government to be able to stop terrorist attacks or riots before they happen, right? But it also means detaining people who haven't actually been convicted of any crime.
Exactly. And that's why these laws are so contentious from a civil liberties perspective. They seem to go against the fundamental principle that someone is innocent until proven guilty.
India wasn't the only country grappling with these issues in the mid-20th century. The United States and United Kingdom had used similar preventive detention measures during World War II. But India was unique in explicitly providing for preventive detention in its constitution during peacetime.
That's a great point. Article 22 of the Indian Constitution laid out some protections for people subjected to preventive detention, but also gave Parliament the power to make laws, allowing for longer periods of detention in certain circumstances.
So in a sense, the framers of India's constitution were trying to strike a balance, acknowledging that preventive detention might sometimes be necessary, but also putting some guardrails around it.
Right? And that brings us to the Preventive Detention Act of 1950, which A.K.Gopalan challenged in this case. He argued that the law violated his fundamental rights under Articles 19, 21, and 22 of the Constitution.
Let's break down those arguments one by one. First, Article 19 guarantees certain freedoms to Indian citizens, including the freedom of movement throughout India. Gopalan argued that preventive detention inherently violated this right.
The Supreme Court ultimately rejected this argument. The majority opinion held that Article 19 only applied to free citizens, not those under lawful detention. They said once someone is detained, Article 19 no longer applies to them.
That's interesting. So they drew a distinction between restrictions on a free person's movement, which would fall under Article 19, and total deprivation of liberty through detention, which they said was governed by other constitutional provisions.
Exactly. The court essentially said that Article 19 and preventive detention laws operate in different spheres. This was a crucial ruling because it meant preventive detention laws wouldn't be subject to the reasonableness test that applies to restrictions on Article 19 rights.
Gopalan's second main argument related to Article 21, which states that no person shall be deprived of life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. He contended this meant the law had to follow principles of natural justice.
This was really the heart of the case. Gopalan's lawyers argued that procedure established by law should be interpreted similarly to the Due Process Clause in the U.S. Constitution, meaning it required not just any procedure laid down by statute, but a fair and reasonable procedure.
And this is where we see a major divergence between Indian and American constitutional law. The majority of the Supreme Court rejected this broad interpretation of Article 21.
That's right. They held that procedure established by law simply meant procedure laid down by statute. As long as Parliament had passed a law prescribing a procedure, that was sufficient to satisfy Article 21. The courts couldn't scrutinize whether that procedure was fair or reasonable.
This was a hugely consequential decision. It essentially meant that Parliament had very wide latitude to make laws restricting personal liberty, as long as they laid down some kind of procedure.
Exactly. The court was very clear that it wasn't their role to judge the wisdom or fairness of laws passed by Parliament. They saw their job as simply interpreting the Constitution as written, not imposing their own views of what rights should be protected.
It's worth noting that this narrow interpretation of Article 21 was eventually overturned decades later in the landmark Maneka Gandhi case in 1978. But for many years, the Gopalan decision was the prevailing view.
That's a great point about the long-term impact. Now, Gopalan did win one small victory in this case related to Article 22 of the Constitution, which laid out some specific protections for preventive detention.
Right. Article 22 required that detainees be informed of the grounds for their detention and be allowed to make representations against the detention order. The court struck down Section 14 of the Preventive Detention Act, which had prohibited detainees from disclosing these grounds to the court.
The justices felt this provision conflicted with the right to constitutional remedies under Article 32, since it prevented detainees from effectively challenging their detention in court.
It's interesting to see how the court approached these different constitutional provisions. They took a very narrow view of Articles 19 and 21, giving a lot of deference to Parliament, but they were willing to strike down a specific provision that conflicted with Article 22.
That's a good observation. I think it reflects the court's overall approach of trying to interpret the Constitution strictly as written, without reading in additional protections that weren't explicitly stated.
One thing that stands out to me is how much the historical context shaped this decision. India had just gained independence a few years earlier and was facing significant internal security challenges. The justices seemed very concerned about not hampering the government's ability to maintain public order.
Absolutely. Several of the opinions explicitly mention the need for preventive detention laws to deal with threats like communal violence. There was clearly a sense that India's nascent democracy needed strong powers to protect itself.
It's a classic tension we see in many countries, how to balance security and liberty, especially in times of real or perceived crisis. The Gopalan court came down pretty firmly on the side of giving the government broad powers.
That's true, though it's worth noting that even the majority opinions express some discomfort with preventive detention in principle. Justice Das, for instance, calls it odious, but says the court has to interpret the Constitution as written.
That's a good point. The justices seem to view their role very narrowly, not to question the wisdom of the Constitution or laws passed under it, but simply to ensure they were being followed.
Exactly. And this gets at a fundamental debate in constitutional interpretation that we still see today. Should courts stick to a strict, literal reading of the text, or should they take a more expansive view to protect individual rights?
The Gopalan court clearly came down on the side of strict textualism. But as you mentioned earlier, later courts took a different approach, reading more robust protections into provisions like Article 21.
It's fascinating to see how constitutional interpretation evolves over time. The Gopalan decision seems very deferential to government power by today's standards, but at the time it was seen as a careful, restrained approach to judicial review.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we have to understand these decisions in their historical context. The idea of courts striking down laws or second-guessing security measures was still relatively new in India at the time.
That's a great point. The Indian Supreme Court was really just beginning to define its role and its relationship to the other branches of government. This case helped set the tone for how it would approach constitutional questions for years to come.
As we wrap up, what do you think are the key takeaways from this case for our listeners?
I think there are a few big ones. First, it established a very narrow interpretation of personal liberty protections under the Indian Constitution, giving Parliament broad powers to restrict freedom in the name of security.
Second, it drew some important distinctions between different types of rights and how they apply to people in detention versus free citizens.
Third, it set a precedent of judicial restraint and deference to Parliament on matters of personal liberty and national security. This approach would be influential for decades.
And finally, I think it highlights how much constitutional law is shaped by the historical and political context. The concerns and priorities of 1950 led to a very different outcome than we might see today.
Those are all great points, Michael. This case really laid the groundwork for how fundamental rights would be interpreted in India for years to come. While some aspects have been overturned, it remains an incredibly influential decision in Indian constitutional law.
Absolutely. And it's a fascinating window into how a newly independent nation was grappling with balancing individual liberty and national security. These are debates that continue around the world today.
That's so true. Well, I think that about wraps up our discussion of A.K.Gopalan v. State of Madras. We hope our listeners found it informative.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll be back next time with another landmark judgment to explore on the Ask Junior Judgment Podcast.